The lawyer's mahogany office smelled like old money, old paper, and the fresh, crushing weight of my father's betrayal. I sat rigidly in an uncomfortable chair, my hands clasped so tightly that my knuckles had turned white. My brother Victor sat beside me, relaxed and confident, already basking in the certainty of what was coming. He knew. Somehow he had known. Mr. Thompson, the estate lawyer, was a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and a practiced, neutral expression. He cleared his throat and opened the leather folder that contained my father's final will, the document that would determine what remained of my family and what remained of my dignity. The estate of Richard Sterling, Mr. Thompson began, his voice formal and careful, has been divided as follows. To Victor Sterling, I bequeath 100% ownership of Sterling Builders, all associated machinery, equipment, and the substantial liquid assets of the company, currently valued at approximately $42 million. Victor smiled. That smile, that same smug, superior smile I had seen 1,000 times across 31 years of competition, exclusion, and calculated cruelty. Then Mr. Thompson turned to me. And to you, Juliana Thorne, your father bequeaths the family home, the Victorian property on Laurel Street. The room seemed to tilt. The Victorian, the falling apart, 3-story monstrosity that my father had always called the old burden. The house that was literally crumbling. The house that required constant, expensive repairs. The house that represented everything my father thought was worthless, including, apparently, me. Victor's laughter exploded through the silence. It was a sharp, cruel sound that cut like broken glass. "The collapsing burden!" he cackled, his voice dripping with contempt. "Oh, Jules, that's perfect. That's absolutely perfect. Enjoy the back taxes and the deteriorating foundation, sister. That house will bankrupt you within 2 years." I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I was frozen in the moment of absolute annihilation. Then Mr. Thompson adjusted his glasses and added one final detail, his voice carefully neutral. "The property is structurally unsound and must be demolished within 90 days per city code. Failure to comply will result in heavy municipal fines and forced demolition at the owner's expense." 90 days. I had 90 days to figure out what to do with a property that was literally scheduled for destruction. My inheritance wasn't just worthless. It was a debt, an eviction notice, a public humiliation wrapped in mahogany and handed to me by my own father. I am Juliana Thorne, 31 years old, a licensed architect with a degree from one of the most prestigious schools in the country. I had spent the last 2 years of my life, the most crucial career-building years of my professional development, as my father's unpaid, full-time hospice caregiver. I had held his hand while he deteriorated. I had managed his medications. I had sat with him through the long, painful nights when the cancer kept him awake and terrified. I had given up job offers, consulting contracts, and the opportunity to build my own reputation in my field. I did it because I loved him. I did it because I believed he loved me. I was devastatingly, catastrophically wrong. While I was caring for him, my brother Victor had been something else entirely. A manipulator, a user, a man who visited my father exactly 3 times during his 6-month illness, but apparently had spent those visits poisoning my father's perception of me. "Juliana's too careful," Victor would whisper during those visits. "Her designs are too slow, too meticulous, not aggressive enough for the market. You should give the company to someone with vision." My father had always favored Victor, the bold one, the risk-taker, the son who didn't ask questions and didn't point out when things didn't make financial sense. When Victor needed money to bail out a failed investment, my father gave it to him without hesitation. When I asked for help with my college tuition, my father told me I should earn my way. This will was his final statement, his ultimate message. A cold, public confirmation that my sacrifice meant nothing, that my loyalty was worthless, that I had been nothing more than unpaid household help. I drove directly to the house after leaving the lawyer's office. The Victorian stood on Laurel Street like a monument to decay. 3 stories of deteriorating brick, sagging gutters, and broken windows that looked like empty eyes. The property itself was magnificent, a 2-acre lot in the most expensive neighborhood in the city. But the building itself was falling apart. I pulled into the driveway and sat in my car for a long time, just staring at it. The front gate hung crooked on its hinges. The garden had become wild, overgrown with weeds and dying shrubs. The porch steps had visible gaps between the boards. And on the back of the property, I could see the commercial lot beyond the chained and padlocked back gate, the lot where Sterling Builders had constructed its new headquarters 5 years ago. A beautiful, modern, multi-story building valued at $15 million. My father had built Victor's empire while I was wiping his fevered forehead. I got out of my car and walked to the front porch. I sat on the steps, still wearing my nice lawyer's office dress, and I cried. But crying, I would eventually realize, was a luxury I couldn't afford. My first decision was to stop wallowing. I had 90 days, not a long time, but possibly enough time if I used it strategically. I couldn't save the house by fighting the demolition order. The structural issues were real and documented, but I could buy time. I contacted the city planning office and requested an extension for historical preservation research, citing the Victorians' architectural significance. I framed it as a potential historic designation project. The city clerk, who seemed sympathetic to the idea of preserving an original 1920s Victorian, granted me a 30-day extension. 60 days remained. During that extension period, I moved into the house. I packed my few belongings and set up in the attic, the one room that seemed structurally sound, with a sloped ceiling and dormer windows overlooking the neighborhood. I couldn't afford an apartment. I couldn't afford anything. But I could live here for free, at least temporarily. I told myself I was living here to secure the property. The truth was, I had nowhere else to go. 3 weeks into my stay, I discovered the vault. I was doing a detailed structural assessment, habits from architecture school diehard, examining the dry rot in the main floor library. I was looking at the wooden wall paneling, tracing the grain patterns, and checking for moisture damage, when something caught my eye. One panel didn't match the others. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but the grain pattern was slightly different. The finish was slightly different. This panel was newer than the others, but not recently installed. Perhaps 30 years old. Perhaps longer. I used a crowbar to gently pry at the edges. The panel gave way with surprising ease, revealing a narrow gap behind it. Inside the gap was a small, heavy steel vault. Old. Very old. Possibly original to the house. My hands were shaking as I pulled it out and set it on the library floor. The vault had a combination lock, but it was ancient and corroded. I applied steady pressure, and eventually it gave way with a metallic click. Inside the vault were documents, dozens of them, faded, yellowed papers that smelled like time itself, survey documents, property deeds, and most importantly, a century-old easement agreement filed by my grandfather in 1924. I sat on the library floor and began to read. I spent the next 3 days studying those documents with the intensity of someone reading ancient scripture. I had learned enough about property law in my architecture courses to understand the basics, but these documents were complex, written in the legal language of the 1920s. I photographed every page carefully and sent them to Ms. Patricia Dubois, the sharpest property law attorney I could find, recommended by a fellow architect who had seen her win an impossible land dispute case. Ms. Dubois called me back within 2 hours. "Juliana," she said, her voice measured but intense, "I need to confirm something with you. This easement, this document that your grandfather filed in 1924, do you understand what it means?" "I think so," I said carefully. "It says the owner of this Victorian property has exclusive control over the 7-foot-wide service access lane on the eastern boundary, the lane that connects the main road to the property behind it." "Yes," Ms. Dubois said. "And the property behind it is now the Sterling Builders' headquarters." the one valued at $15 million. I felt something cold and crystalline form in my chest. Not anger. Not yet. Just clarity. The building requires that access lane, Ms. Du Bois continued. It's the only route for emergency vehicles, delivery trucks, and service access. Without it, the building violates every fire code and building code in the city. The building is rendered completely unusable. So Victor's building is worthless, I said slowly. Without access, yes, Ms. Du Bois confirmed. Unless your brother can prove the easement is invalid or expired, which, based on these documents, he cannot. That easement has been in place for 100 years. It's legally ironclad. I hung up the phone and sat in the library of my condemned house, surrounded by the dust of decades, and I began to smile. My strategy crystallized over the next 2 weeks. Victor believed the house was worthless. He believed I was a victim who would soon be homeless and broken. He believed the path was clear for him to sell the Sterling Builders headquarters to a major development company, a sale that would net him approximately $50 million in profit and finally give him the financial security he craved. What he didn't know was that I held the key to everything. But I had to move carefully. I had to gather evidence properly. I had to work within the law, because if I made any mistakes, Victor would have legal grounds to challenge me. I hired Ms. Du Bois on a contingency basis, meaning she would be paid only if we won. Drawing from the eventual settlement, Ms. Du Bois, who had reviewed the easement documents and understood their implications, agreed immediately. This, she said during our first meeting, is going to be the most satisfying case I've worked on in 15 years. My next move was critical. I needed to understand why Victor was so confident he could sell the building despite the easement issue. The answer came from an unexpected source. I hired a licensed private investigator named Marcus Webb, someone recommended by Ms. Du Bois, who specialized in real estate fraud cases. Marcus had access to public records, business filings, and investigation tools that I could never access myself. What he uncovered was explosive. Victor had recently obtained a series of zoning variances from the city planning office. These variances would allow the Sterling Builders headquarters to operate without the traditional access requirements, essentially nullifying the need for the easement. But here's what made it fraud. The variances had been issued by a low-level planning clerk named Chloe Martinez, someone who didn't have the authority to issue such variances. They should have required full city council approval. They should have been publicly disclosed. Instead, they had been fast-tracked through unofficial channels. Marcus dug deeper and discovered the connection. Victor had been paying Chloe through a series of shell companies and high-end consulting services. There were restaurant charges, weekend trips, jewelry purchases, all traceable to Victor's accounts and Chloe's personal expenditures. The affair was secondary to the fraud, but the fraud was primary and it was criminal. He's bribing a city official to falsify zoning variances, Marcus explained, laying out the evidence. This is public corruption. This is fraud. And it means that any sale of the building with these fraudulent variances is itself fraudulent. The buyer could recover damages. Perfect. This was exactly what I needed. I waited until the sale of the Sterling Builders headquarters was nearly finalized. Victor had found a buyer, a major real estate development company that planned to convert the building into luxury condominiums. The closing was set for 6 weeks away. The final purchase price was $15 million. This was the moment. If I acted too early, Victor could attempt to fix the easement issue or delay the sale. If I acted too late, the new owner would be the one holding a worthless property. I had to strike with perfect timing at the moment when Victor was financially committed but unable to complete the transaction. Ms. Du Bois coordinated with both the buyer's legal counsel and the city's planning department. We prepared a comprehensive document package that included 1. The original easement from 1924, properly authenticated and notarized. 2. Expert analysis from Marcus Webb, proving the easement had never been invalidated or expired. 3. documentation of the fraudulent zoning variances for, evidence of the bribery scheme between Victor and Chloe Martinez. All of this evidence had been obtained legally. Marcus had used public records. Ms. Du Bois had filed proper legal inquiries. Nothing had been obtained through illegal means. We were ready. 2 days before the scheduled closing, Ms. Du Bois sent the comprehensive evidence package to the buyer's attorney, the city planning director, and the state attorney general's office. The response was immediate. The buyer backed out of the purchase within hours. They were not going to buy a building with fraudulent permits and a disputed easement that could render their investment worthless. The city planning department launched an investigation into the fraudulent variances. The state attorney general's office opened a criminal inquiry into public corruption charges. And Victor Morrison, owner of an inaccessible, unusable, now valueless $15 million building, suddenly found himself facing financial ruin and criminal charges. I made my final move with precision and absolute legality. I contacted the bank that held the mortgage on the Sterling Builders headquarters. I informed them that the building was no longer marketable due to the fraudulent permits and the easement restriction. The building's value had essentially collapsed. Victor couldn't make the payments on the massive construction loan he had taken out to build the headquarters. He couldn't sell the building to raise capital. He couldn't prove the easement invalid. He was trapped. The bank called in the loan. Victor faced immediate foreclosure. To avoid complete bankruptcy, Victor was forced to liquidate everything: the Sterling Builders machinery, the company's contracts, all remaining assets. The company that had been valued at $42 million was being dismantled piece by piece, and I was the only buyer. Using my own carefully accumulated savings, money I had earned through years of architectural work before my father's illness, and a loan secured by the now valuable Victorian property, which had become valuable precisely because it held the easement, I purchased the remnants of Sterling Builders from the bank's auction. I bought the company for $8.3 million, a fraction of its original value. I bought it with the strategic precision of someone who understood exactly what she was taking control of. The transformation took 3 months. Using the company's own resources, I began the careful restoration of the Victorian house. The restoration was done properly by architects and contractors who understood historical preservation. The house that had been scheduled for demolition became a showpiece, a restored 1920s beauty with original architectural details and modern systems. The easement lane was properly maintained and secured, with appropriate legal documentation protecting its status. Sterling Builders, under new management and new leadership, began to operate with integrity and ethical business practices. I hired talented architects and engineers, people like me who believed in quality work and honest dealing. The company's contracts, which had been scattered and undervalued, were consolidated and renegotiated. Within 18 months, Sterling Builders was profitable again. Within 2 years, the company was thriving. Victor and Chloe Martinez were both indicted on public corruption charges. Victor received a 4-year prison sentence. Chloe received 2 years, plus permanent loss of her professional licenses. Victor emerged from prison to discover that his family business was now owned and operated by his sister, the sister he had mocked at the will reading, the sister he had assumed was worthless, the sister he had driven into poverty and homelessness, the sister who had studied the patterns of power and had learned to move within them with surgical precision. I stood in the renovated Victorian house, now my home, my office, and the headquarters of Sterling Builders, on the 5th anniversary of my father's death. The library where I had found the vault was now my personal study. The mahogany-framed windows looked out toward the city skyline. On my desk was a photograph of my grandfather, the man who had filed that easement in 1924, probably for reasons that made perfect sense in his era, reasons that had echoed down a century and had ultimately saved me. I had inherited debt and destruction. I had inherited public mockery and the confirmation of my own worthlessness in my father's eyes. But I had also inherited something my father never understood. I had inherited the strength to build something real. The first employees I hired at Sterling Builders were young women, architects, engineers, construction managers, people who had been overlooked or undervalued by the industry. I paid them well. I gave them meaningful work. I created a company culture that valued intelligence and integrity over bluster and ego. Victor's approach to business had been aggressive dominance. My approach was strategic excellence. Victor's company had operated on manipulation and financial shortcuts. My company operated on reputation and long-term thinking. By the 5th year, Sterling Builders had contracts with the most prestigious developers in 3 states. We specialized in restoration work and ethical new development. We were known for quality, honesty, and architectural innovation. The company had become what I had always dreamed it could be. I never spoke to Victor after his release from prison. He had attempted to contact me once through a lawyer, requesting that I use my influence to help him find employment. The letter was forwarded to Ms. Du Bois, who filed it with the rest of the case record. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say to a man who had mocked his sister's inheritance while standing at the will reading, believing her to be destroyed. Victor had made his assumptions about my weakness. I had simply waited for him to make his moves, and then I had countered with evidence and strategy and the unwavering precision of someone who had absolutely nothing left to lose. The most poetic justice came 3 years into my ownership of Sterling Builders. The city designated the Victorian House as a historic landmark, a protected property that could never be demolished. The same house that had been scheduled for destruction in 90 days became the most protected structure in the neighborhood. My worthless inheritance had become one of the most valuable addresses in the city. Victor's $15 million building sat empty and abandoned, inaccessible and unsellable, a monument to his greed and his miscalculation. And I, the daughter my father had deemed unworthy, had become the owner of the thriving, ethical, successful company he had assumed belonged to my brother by divine right. I stood in the library one evening alone, looking at the original easement documents in their display case. I thought about my grandfather, whom I had never known, who had filed those papers 100 years ago. I thought about the choices he had made, the property divisions he had structured, the legal foundations he had laid that had eventually saved me. I thought about my father, who had been so blinded by preference that he couldn't see what was right in front of him. A daughter who loved him. A daughter who sacrificed for him. A daughter who had the intelligence and the resilience to survive his betrayal and emerge stronger. And I thought about the woman I had become in the process. Not destroyed by mockery, but hardened into something resilient. Not broken by inheritance debt, but transformed by the necessity of survival into someone capable of building something real. The burden had become the foundation. The worthless inheritance had become the key to everything. If you've made it this far, you understand. Respect is non-negotiable. My worth wasn't defined by Victor's mocking laughter or the demolition notice he served. My story proves that silence can be a weapon, and patience, the patience to dig through old deeds and find that century-old easement, can be absolute power. If this resonated with you, if your family has gaslit you into professional invisibility and debt, tell yourself this: your silence doesn't make you weak. Your boundaries don't make you difficult. Your survival makes you extraordinary. Never let a bully assume your expertise is a burden. The revolution happens when you decide to write your own ending. He got the business. I got the house that controlled the business. Share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe.